Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 16th of September. Today we're doing an update on the situation in Kherson and around Andriivka and Klishchiivka. Let's begin by looking at what's going on around Kherson, where I do want to make an update on the troop concentrations for the Ukrainian and Russian forces respectively, because I've been getting this question a lot: how many forces do both sides have? So I want to look at the types of units they have and the specific number of men. So starting off with the Russian side, the Russian forces in this area on the Kherson front, which I would say spans the area just to the east of the Kinburn Peninsula all the way to also Kharivka, that area generally, and all of it is divided by the Dnieper River. That is the natural barrier separating the Russian and Ukrainians. The name of the Russian forces in this region is the Dnieper Group of Forces, and they appear to be serving as a large task organized formation, with the objective being to hold the line at the Dnieper River to prevent Ukrainian breakthroughs past that river and towards additional Russian-controlled territories in Kherson Oblast. So there is this report by the Ukrainian General Staff that was published on March 5th, and it outlines the operational structure of the Dnieper Group of Forces. Now, obviously, you can't really trust anything that either side is saying at face value, but the reason why I am not as skeptical of the units that are mentioned by the General Staff is because most of those units I was able to find evidence of that they were operating on the Kherson front and just through video evidence. Really, the only units that I couldn't back up independently besides the report from the Ukrainian General Staff on March 5th were territorial defense units that Russia has recently formed and sent to the front lines. And this makes sense because they're relatively obscure formations that haven't been known about very publicly up until recently. And those units I have marked in this like NATO symbology. This is the enemy units marker. And they don't actually have logos just because of how obscure they are and recently well known they've become. And you could see that there's a lot of them on the front line over here. And I don't really doubt that because most of Russia's older forces from other motorized rifle regiments or brigades or from air assault divisions have been moved to other parts of the front line. So this makes sense that these territorial units will be sent to the front line to fill that void. The Ukrainian General Staff, they mentioned there was a first echelon, so that would probably be Russia's frontline forces. And what they mentioned is that this echelon spanned from Rybachny, and it made it all the way up to the northeast to the village of Velika Lepetika. And in terms of the army corps that are within this first echelon, you have two. You have the 49th Combined Arms Army, and you have the Black Sea Fleet's 22nd Army Corps. Now, there's also mention within this report from March. Again, I want to remind you guys, this is a really long time ago, so a lot has changed since then, and we will make note of that. But within the report, there's also mention of the 7th Guards Air Assault Division, which is a division that is a part of the VDV, so it's Airborne Forces. They were also stationed around the Kherson front within this first echelon for a very long time. They were fighting, I think, even during the Kherson counteroffensive when the Ukrainians were attacking. But very recently, over the past 3 weeks, it's been moved to the Robotyne sector, including its 3 air assault regiments that were really at the forefront of the fighting at Kherson. Now they've been moved to the area around Robotyne and Verbove over here, and that includes the 56th, 108th, and 247th Air Assault Regiments. So this would certainly decrease the amount of Russian forces that are within the first echelon defending the Kherson front. Now, in terms of other units that are involved, you have the mention of the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade. But the thing is, this is another unit that was previously stationed near the Dnieper River that was also moved to the Robotyne sector, and another one of the more experienced Russian units that has been moved away from Kherson. So of the list of units mentioned by Ukraine on the first echelon, the ones that I could confirm are still at the front line at this point in time in September are 4 infantry brigades and then 4 of the territorial motorized rifle regiments. You can see that the ones that are in the first echelon I have placed closer to the Dnieper River in the line of contact. I think the best unit that the Russians still have at this line is the 61st Naval Infantry Brigade. It's still there, but a lot of these other ones, you could see they're motor rifle regiments, territorial, and then you also have here the 88th Arctic Motor Rifle Brigade. I believe that's also still near the Dnieper River, and you have Spetsnaz Brigade, and then here you have another Motor Rifle Brigade, and then here you have this Coastal Defense Brigade. At the time that the General Staff released the reports, they claimed that the first echelon had about 15,500 men. And if that were true, then it would show that the Russian units are at very low strength. They're not at full strength. So I don't know how much I believe that, but I do believe the specific units based on what I said before. But what the Ukrainians are saying, at least in their report, is that they had some manpower issues, but that they had a very large artillery component and that they had a lot of engineering support, and that engineering component was able to build a lot of fortifications and set up a lot of mines near the front line. And you could see the results of that based on the fortification map in the light green. You could see all of that being constructed. Then the Ukrainians also reported on the second echelon, which is on the rear, presumably, and this means that the Russians would have the capability to rotate forces throughout the past few months. And you can see that the line of the second echelon started around the village of Bekhteri over here, and it spans all the way to the village of Zelenipid over here. So I'll just show that zooming out for a second so you guys can get an idea of where this echelon is located, generally over here. So you could see that is a okay distance away from the Dnieper River, about 20-30 kilometers away, and that's where they set up camp. Now, in terms of the units involved in the second echelon, you have 4 of those territorial motorized rifle regiments. Then you have the 88th Motorized Rifle Brigade, which I mentioned before, and you also have the 8th Artillery Regiment of the 22nd Army Corps. And the Ukrainian sources claimed that this grouping had 10,500 personnel, which I could see being accurate at the time, but it's possible that since then, due to the fact that Russia has been forming a lot of these motorized rifle regiments, and they've been increasing the amount of personnel stationed within those units, it is possible that since then the number of Russian forces has actually increased, but I don't have concrete numbers for that. Now, in terms of operational reserves, there was one unit that was mentioned, the 214th Tank Regiment, which is over here. I have it as operational reserves, and they already have their tank formations as of March, and they also had these motorized battalions that were supposed to be formed, and it's been a while since that report, so perhaps by now they already have those motorized battalions in reserves. They could, in theory, be sent to the front line if needed. Now, in addition to the units mentioned by the Ukrainians, I also independently added in different units that I found over the course of my research, and I tracked about 4 BARS battalions from Russia's Volunteer Special Combat Army Reserve, and the Russians also have 1 Territorial Motorized Rifle Regiment that I didn't previously mention, 1 Motorized Rifle Regiment, 1 Spetsnaz Brigade that I mentioned before, 1 Volunteer Brigade, 1 Control Brigade, and I think actually 2 artillery brigades. There's this one over here, the 439th, and there's also the 227th, which is located over here. Now, when you do all the math for that, and again, this is just rough estimates because I don't have specific numbers, I don't have inside information, this is all public. The first echelon has about 12,000 men, second echelon has about 11,000 men, and then the extra amount of forces that I independently looked for and added to the map is another 12,000 roughly. So you could say about 35,000 Russian troops, not on the front line exclusively. As I said before, second echelon is on the front line, it's on the rear, and you also have reserves. So yeah, that includes really the entire Kherson region, at least the areas that are near the Dnieper River, and that are in relation to the entire Kherson operational sector, where we're going over with these red rectangles. Now, on the Ukrainian side, there's a similar story when it comes to territorial units. A lot of Ukraine's core in this region consists of territorial defense brigades, and the name of at least one of the groupings that Ukraine has stationed near the Dnieper River is the Thunder Tactical Group. And I don't have any specifics on the units that are within the Thunder Tactical Group. There's no source mentioning that. But in terms of the broader number of infantry brigades, battalions that are involved, you have 5 different brigades. Of those 5, 4 of them are TDF, and then 1 is National Guard Brigade. That one National Guard is over here. And then on the map, you could also see all the territorial units that I have marked on the map. Then you also have a few smaller additional special force units. You have the involvement of police detachments. You have border detachments. You have SSO units. You have SBU detachments. And you also have one artillery brigade that I have marked over here, the 406th Artillery Brigade, which is really at the forefront of a lot of Ukraine's shelling of Russian positions, especially around the Holopristan sector over here. And yeah, you could see for yourself on the map. I didn't add in all of the special formations that Ukraine has, but just know that most of them are pretty small in size. So when you add them up together, it does come to it's a sizable number in the thousands, but it doesn't add to that significant of a number. Really, the core of Ukraine's formations in this region come from those 5 infantry brigades. And so when you do the math on that, Ukraine roughly has 15 to 25,000 men. And so let's say you're going for 20 to 35. That's about a 1 to 1.5 ratio, something around that number between the Ukrainians and Russians respectively. Actually, that would be 1.7 to 1, but let's say it was 30,000 Russian forces, 20,000 Ukrainians, then that would be 1.5 to 1 in favor of the Russians. But again, I just want to remind everybody that the way that Russians are looking at this is through the perspective of defense. That's why they're not sending in better trained forces of a higher caliber. Those are being moved into other sectors. So the Russian forces in this unit, they were recently created in order to fill the void and in order to just ensure that there aren't any Ukrainian surprise attacks in this region, which, as we know, there's no indication of that yet, just because looking at the composition of Ukrainian forces, you don't really see as many of these mechanized forces. You don't see as many offensive-minded units that were recently created. It's just territorial defense units that have been conducting some raids, but their offensive capabilities are, you could say, less than that of, for instance, like an air assault brigade that Ukraine has in Robotyne. Now, in other news, the Kherson Oblast Defense Council ordered a mandatory evacuation of all families with children from 31 specific settlements that were listed out. And so here on the map in white, I have a polygon going over those settlements that were mentioned in the reports by the Kherson officials. And there are some pretty notable settlements that are near the Dnieper River that were mentioned. You have Bilozerka, for instance. That's a big one. You have Mikilske. You have Berislav. That's probably the largest one. You have Zmivka over here, Novokairi, Milove, if you're going up to the north, Duchani, for instance. And it just keeps on going up and up. And so all of those settlements will be evacuated of families and children, and this is a mandatory evacuation, but this is not of all civilians, as they made explicitly clear through the statement. Now, in terms of the reason why, that is because of shelling, according to the Ukrainian officials. They're saying that there is a threat of shelling to those civilians. There's also some people that are theorizing that it may have to do with the fact that there are Russian collaborators that are giving information about Ukrainian positions near the line of contact to the Russian side. And so they want to clamp down on that by just evacuating all civilians. But as I said before, they're not evacuating all civilians yet. And also, they did not mention the city of Kherson itself as being evacuated. I don't know why that is. Maybe I'm missing something. If somebody could tell me in the comments why, because you'd expect Kherson to also be evacuated within the scenario. Maybe there's been previous evacuations, like during the flooding or something. I'm not exactly sure about why. Now, I'd also caution people to not jump to the conclusion that this means that there's going to be any sort of massive offensive activity taken by either side in the near future. Because if we look at the Kupiansk situation, for instance, in that region, like a month ago, there was also a Ukrainian evacuation of 68 settlements near the front line, and that was also during the time that Russia made some advances. They advanced a couple of kilometers, so it really seemed like there was an indication that Russia would continue advancing in the minds of some people, but that really never materialized, and that was also a misunderstanding of Russia's objectives in the region. And so I'd also urge people not to make a similar mistake around here and assume that like the Ukrainians are going on the attack, for instance, or vice versa. Now, moving on to the situation in Andriivka, there was some ambiguity about this village yesterday, with the Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister announcing the capture of the village, while the 3rd Assault Brigade, a unit actually operating on the front line for the Ukrainians around the southern Bakhmut flank, alleged that the fighting was ongoing. Today, there was confirmation by the Ukrainian General Staff that they were able to fully capture Andriivka, but this cannot be independently verified because there is no video evidence of Ukrainian forces actually entering the village. But based on the aerial view of the situation, it seems like it is a gray zone and that the Russians have withdrawn to the rail line just to the east of Andriivka. But even in the rail line to the east of Andriivka, it's not like you have a massive amount of Russian forces. They are in very small groups because, again, it is pretty far away from many of the other Russian towns in the region that are used as coordination points. The closest Russian villages in the region past Andriivka include Kherson to the south, which is now a Ukrainian goal as they can use their positions that are to the north of Kherson to flank the village. And then you have to go a couple of kilometers to the east of the rail line all the way to Andriivka and to the highway to the south of Bakhmut to reach the next unified Russian line, which would be a worst case scenario fallback line if the Ukrainians were able to continue pressure on the rail line to the east of Andriivka. But in terms of what's going on now, you do still have Russian forces within this rail line, and I have it marked under Russian control because you still have small Russian groups that are operating in the tunnels that are under the rail line, and that's where they have some of their ammo depots, some of their forces organized over there, and that's a big part of why Russia was able to continue holding on to Andriivka for the better parts of the past few weeks, despite the very, very heavy fighting in the region, is because of these tunnel systems that are around Andriivka and around the rail line that helped the Russians reinforce their positions. But now the Russians have finally been forced to completely withdraw due to envelopment by the Ukrainians on the southern flank, on the northern flank, and from the west. And also because the town has just been so destroyed after months of heavy fighting in the region that holding on to positions over there is definitely untenable. So here you can see how it looks like based off of an aerial view, and it just goes to show for itself how difficult it is for a large garrison of forces to hold on to it. You can see the village is completely abandoned. There are two different streets in the village, and every single house is affected in some capacity. Most of the houses are just completely devastated, but others aren't totally destroyed. As a result, they could, in theory, be used as cover for smaller groups, not a large force, obviously, but for a smaller Ukrainian force when they do intend to enter that village, as they have not done so yet. And just to give you guys an idea of the rail line that I was just talking about, here you have Andriivka. I'll mark it in red, the two streets, and just directly to the east of it, you have the rail line over here, and that rail line is surrounded. It's actually surrounded by two different windbreaks or hedgerows that run parallel to it. And this was a big part of why Ukraine was able to get control of the southern flank, because the Ukrainians were able to get control of basically the hedgerows to the south of Andriivka that were running parallel to the rail line over here. And I gave them a new permanent position to launch attacks onto the village of Andriivka from the south. So now if we are to look at the topographic map just to get an idea of what's going on, here you can see Andriivka, and you can see all of the areas to the south of Klishchiivka where Ukraine is now increasing their presence. I'll mark that in red over here, and that is located on relatively high ground, but it is similar to the elevation of the Russian forces within Kherson. So there is not really any elevation advantage over there. But nonetheless, the Ukrainians do have an opportunity to flank the Russian forces in Kherson, and based on Ukrainian statements, it does seem like they do intend to make that their next goal. So we'll see how Russia goes about defending that village. And then if we look at the highway to the south of Bakhmut, which would be the natural line of defense after the rail line, if that were to fall, you can see that the area in between the rail line and the highway is on relatively low elevation compared to the Ukrainian controlled positions. In the areas just to the west of Klishchiivka, there is a very high ground just to the west of Klishchiivka, and also in the area to the west of Andriivka. But if you go a bit to the south to the Kherson area, that's also still under Russian control. That's where the elevation is pretty much on par with Ukrainian positions. So that could definitely be a Ukrainian goal to take out that Russian advantage by attacking to the south first. But that is more into the future. For now, let's go back to the situation around Klishchiivka. So in northern Klishchiivka, there was an announcement by the Kostus Kalinowski Regiment, which is a unit of Belarusians fighting for Ukraine, where they claimed that they were able to fully secure the village, but then eventually deleted the post and clarified that there's still fighting going on. And this is an accurate depiction because the northeastern part of Klishchiivka is still a gray zone. We actually have a video that was released by the 118th Territorial Defense Brigade, which is a unit that the Ukrainians are using to fight on the front lines. So I'll show that over here. It's a video of Russian forces, about 12 of them, maybe a bit more. And you can see as they are withdrawing, this is in the northeastern part of Klishchiivka. This is a video of those forces withdrawing from the village, and you could see the destruction that has been caused. And you could tell that they're withdrawing from the village because they're walking towards the rail line, and the rail line is to the north, to the northeast specifically of Klishchiivka. And you can see as they're withdrawing, they are being targeted with mortar fire from the 118th Brigade. So I'll let the video run for a second, but just to give you guys an idea of the geolocation, you could see that it was actually marked over here. And that really gives you an idea of where the Russians are operating, if they're even in large forces in Klishchiivka at all at the moment. But that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.